Hello everybody and welcome to part 2 of me building my 32 Ford Roadster. Now in the first video we talked about kind of the basics of front suspension, the options for rear suspension, what to look for when you're buying a chassis, but I did miss one thing, and that is boxing and C-channeling. Now one of the benefits of your chassis being completely boxed is just adds a lot of rigidity, takes a lot of the flex out of the chassis. And the benefit of your chassis being C-channeled is that you get to get a lower ride height, but again, you buy back some of the room you need for your up travel in order to not affect the handling of your hot rod. If you're buying out there and there's a stock frame or something that is not fully boxed, but is C-channeled, you want to make sure that it's boxed at least behind whatever your rear leaf spring or your coilover is and right up to the front of it in order to get your rigidity back. If you were just to take a stock chassis, cut a C in it, you're going to lose a lot of rigidity back here. So make sure you're not buying anybody's half-done work. So I hope that by now you have not only a general understanding of what type of options you have when it comes to your chassis and your suspension, but I hope that you also have your chassis, your front and your rear suspension, because in this video I want to go through the process of actually taking those parts, building some stands, and setting up your suspension, tacking everything in, measuring it all out, making sure it's all square to get ready for steering. Now what you see here is actually more than what you need in order to set up your rear suspension. Of course, the physical items you need: chassis, rear axle housing, and all the components to your rear suspension. Now you don't need your third member, your axles, not even your coilovers, and that's going to make sense in a little bit. Let's go on to the front. For your front end, you need your front axles, your spring purchase, your shackles, front spring, radius rods, and of course the appropriate hardware in order to get those tacked into your chassis. So you might be thinking, what about those shock mounts? Again, not 100% critical to get this step done. One of the strategies that I used, and the reasons why I was actually able to afford a 32 Ford, was because I only ever bought the critical parts that I needed, worked on that for a few weeks or a month. As I saved more money, sold stuff, went to swap meets, and that's how I kept my build progressing. Now, the first step of mock-up is to actually prepare all your rod ends. Whether your front suspension or rear suspension, you're going to always use some type of heim joint, clevis, tie rod. Your kit will normally come with whatever is required. Now what you want to do in order to prep these is grab the jam nut and tighten that down all the way. Then take 3/4 of your tread, mark that with your finger, and drop that jam nut all the way to whatever 3/4 of that exposed amount of thread is. Then go ahead, put some anti-seize, and install this into whatever bar or rod it's actually intended to go into. Ultimately, what you're trying to do is, if you're giving yourself some adjustability in, that same amount of adjustability out visually, but what you always want to do is have at least half of the thread engaging to that rod or bar for your suspension. This is just a cool safety precaution to make sure you're not running your bar all the way to its end. Now, the last tip that I have for you, for example, if you're setting up your four-link bars or your ladder bars, grab both bars after your heim joints or whatever joints are installed. What you want to do is grab 2 longer bolts, grab both bars that are supposed to be identical left and right, and then use the bolts to make sure that they're not only the same length, but also that they're completely flat. Then you can tighten down your jam nuts, get those nice and tight, and you're ready for the next step. The next step is to build your front end. You don't need to necessarily build it underneath your chassis, you can always build it off to the side. But the point is, you want a complete front end with your spring already installed, your radius rods already installed, ready to rock and roll for the next critical step. But before we get there, now when it comes to your front spring, if you only run the 2 biggest springs or your 2 lower springs, the weight of the chassis will actually compress that spring enough to get you really close to whatever your future ride height's going to be. Now I can confirm that once I mocked up this car completely, I was a little bit less than 1/4 of an inch off and my radiator wasn't filled. So I confirm that it works in the front. I can't confirm that in the rear, but I assume it's going to be the same. So again, just a quick tip for you that when you're mocking this up, take your spring apart and only use those 2 lower springs when it comes to mocking up your suspension. In order to fully set up your suspension, you need to know 3 critical dimensions. The first one is the length of your rear shocks at ride height. Again, don't just go ahead and take a shock and measure it from center to center, because that is the fully extended. Normally, when you're shopping for shocks online, it's a general rule of thumb that whatever number is in the item description, that is the dimension of the shock from center to center at ride height. If you look at the specs, you'll see a dimension for fully compressed and fully extended. We'll get into those numbers in a little bit. But what you need to know is, generally speaking, for a hot rod, you're going to be working with a shock length of anywhere from 10 to 14 inches, 12 being normally what's easiest to find. Now that we know that, there is two critical dimensions left, and that is your tire diameter for the front and the rear. Now, most manufacturers are going to have great specs on their websites. Normally, let's say you're running an 820 on 15-inch wheels like I am, 750s on 16s. Usually, for example, on a high boy, the rear diameter is somewhere around 30 inches. If I remember correctly, my rear tire diameter is 30.3 inches. And the critical dimension you need to know is the radius. So take that diameter, cut that in half. I am at 15.15 inches. Make sure you do the same thing for your front, which of course will likely be smaller. Like I mentioned before, in this video we're not going to cover how to mock up your front shocks. That's because I didn't do it in that order. It's also a quick way to save you some cash and not worry about that just yet. But if you do know what kind of front shock mounts you have and you have those front shocks, you want to get to that step, it might be worth going in the description of this video and seeing if I actually updated where you can go to that video and step. If it's not in there, it's because I haven't uploaded it yet. Now we're almost at a point where we can actually set up our front and rear suspension and our chassis so that we can officially start tacking everything in place. But before you do that, we need to make stands. These stands are going to be adjustable in order to level out all these components in your chassis so that when you tack everything in, it's all legit. Now, in order to do that, first we need to set up kind of just a basic setup at where everything's going to live in order to get the dimension for your stands. Let's move on to the rear end and how to do that. Now, if you remember, one of the critical dimensions was to know your rear tire diameter. Cut that in half, that's your radius. Mine, for example, was 15.15. Now, we're not going for the exacts right now, but what you want to do is set up your rear axle under basic jack stands, probably here at the end, and get the center of the axle tube to be at 15.15 or as close as you can to it for now. The whole point of this is to let the rear axle float where it's going to live for the rest of its life. Now we can move on to the front. So now that your rear end is floating pretty much where it's going to live for the rest of your life, time to grab the chassis and set that on top of your rear axle. Again, we're just trying to get things semi-lined up. You can kind of just use your eye to just kind of gauge that it's all square. Once you do that, grab your front end, which should be assembled by now, and put that underneath your chassis. One quick note, your front end's going to want to continue pivoting back. For that, grab some really long zip ties, or some people like to use really long wire clamps. You wrap it around your chassis, underneath your tie rod end, or whatever end you have, in order to keep those radius rods up close to where they're going to be for the rest of your life. But again, we're going just for basics right now to do a preliminary mock-up. Let's move on to setting your front ride height. Setting up the front end is the same process as the rear end. You want to take your front tire diameter, usually about 26 inches, cut that in half, that'd be 13. Measure from the floor up to 13, and you're going to want to line that up with the center line of your spindle. Now, of course, I'm using the spindle here just to show you that, again, you don't need your front spindle just yet. The key is that the center line of your spindle is usually extremely close to the bottom of the through hole that you use for your lock pin. So, I also don't recommend using your spindle as you move it through its travel. Since the kingpin is at an angle, that dimension is changing. So don't use your front spindles for mock-up. You don't actually need them. Just measure your radius of your front tires, which you should know by now, from the bottom of the floor to the bottom of that hole, and that's going to get you pretty close to where your front axle is going to live for the rest of its life. So now that all your components are pretty much set up, it's time to make some stands. The reason why we did that is so you can get a general length for how tall your stands need to be. Now, in order to make your stands, I just used 1.25 inch square tubing, cut that to whatever dimension I needed. I capped off the end with the plate, drilled a hole through that plate, drilled a nut to that plate, and now I'm using a bolt as my adjuster. Now, the whole purpose of this is once this gets tacked on underneath your chassis, let's say, this is going to allow you to adjust your chassis to make sure everything's level. For your rear end, it's a very similar setup. However, I'm using a 6x6 inch plate to give me a solid foundation and some angle iron cut in at a V on the square tubing to kind of hold that rear end in place. What's nice about this is you'll be able to tack directly from your angle iron to your rear axle once you set pinion angle, but that's going to come in soon. Lastly, you're going to need some shock stands, or fake shocks if you will. Since I know I'm running a 12-inch shock, and you should know what you're running, grab a piece of 1 by 1 inch square tubing and drill 2 through holes at whatever dimension. Mine are 12 inches, these are 12 inches. Now, we don't recommend, even if you have your coilovers or your rear shocks, to use those during mock-up. Reason being is that your bushings are going to allow just enough play to potentially get things in there at a little bit of an angle. Whereas if you're using a piece of square tubing, once this gets bolted straight to your cross member, now you are pretty much sure that this is perpendicular to that cross member. If you go to the bottom, grab a hole, and everything goes in nice and smooth to your mount, you have a good indicator that you're heading in the right direction. Just one of those little checkpoints to make you feel good once you get to that step. Congratulations, you're now at a point to officially start getting everything perfect where it needs to be, level and square, to start tacking in all your suspension points. Everything's going to be very similar to what we already did, but now to the exact measurement. Grab the radius of your rear tire, let's say it's 15.15, grab that 15.15 right to the center line of your rear axle tube. Do that for both sides. Once you do that, it's time to bust out your levels. And you're going to need multiple. I have a bubble level, digital level, and an angle level. Angle finder, if you will. And I used every single one of these just as a way to double check, triple check my work. Once you grab your level, throw it on. If it's not level after you do both sides, don't panic. That's actually quite normal. What that's indicating is that the floor you're working on is not level itself. But that's what the stands are for. So now, let's say this side's a little too low, adjust the bottom of that base to turn the screw in or out to get this a little higher. Once you do that, your axle housing's level and everything's floating in the air exactly where it's going to be at right height. So now that you used your stands and tacked those on to the axle, making sure that it's pointed back 3 degrees for your proper pinion angle, now it's time to focus on your chassis. All you're going to do there is grab the stands that you made, tack those on to the bottom of the chassis, making sure to not tack those on where they're going to interfere with any future mounts. Once your chassis is sitting, what you're going to want to do is not only get it level from side to side, but you're also trying to accomplish 3 more things. One is making sure that your wheelbase is going to end up in the right place. What I did there is just grab the center of my C-notch and drop that down directly above my middle of my axle tube. That's the first thing. The next thing you're also trying to do is making sure that your axle is perpendicular with your chassis. And the last thing you're trying to do is making sure that your chassis is centered with your axle. Now the way to make sure that everything is square and properly aligned is by using triangles for your measurements. For example, I'm not only going to measure from the back of my axle housing to the back of my chassis on each side and make sure those are the same, but again, you're trying to create a triangle, or at least use 3 different points. So that is one. I'm going to create my triangle this way, grab the other side of my axle housing to the back of my chassis, of course always using the same exact points on both sides, and I'm going to take that measurement and check the other side. That is one triangle there. Now how do you complete that triangle? Well, one of the quickest ways is to measure from the side to side. I grab a flat piece of square tubing here, put it on the side, and measure from the inside of my chassis to the outside of my axle flange. And now you've effectively created a triangle with your measurements. Those 3 measurements should line up on the other side. If not, adjust your chassis in order to actually get all those measurements to be exact. By now, you kind of have to use your imagination a little bit, but those 4-link bars wouldn't be there. Your rear axle housing is floating without its shocks, but you want to get your rear of your chassis also floating so that it's all nice and square with your rear axle. When it comes to your front suspension, it's pretty much very similar to the rear end. However, one thing is that since your front spring keys into your front crossmember, you don't have to worry about it from side to side. We can dial that in with the panhard bar later. So the first official step is, again, get your axle to where it's going to live at ride height. And you do that by following the previous steps. Taking the radius of your front tire, measuring it from the ground to the bottom of that lock pin hole. Do that for both sides. If it's still unlevel, that just means the floor is unlevel. Adjust accordingly and get that nice and level. Then, the next step is to make sure that your front axle is perpendicular with the chassis. You can do that just like the rear. Grab different points, at least 3 points, to triangulate your axle and make sure that those measurements are the same for your passenger side to your driver's side. So now that your axle is level and it's square and perpendicular to your chassis, the third and final step is to make sure you have the appropriate caster. Now most hot rods have anywhere between 5 and 9 degrees of caster, with 7 degrees being your sweet spot. It's very likely that your front crossmember has already been welded in at 7 degrees. Now the way that you adjust caster is by your rear mounts. Whether you have adjustability in your bat wings or you're running, wishbones like I am, you're going to want to make sure that all that is set up already, attached to your front axle, and you're going to want to lower or raise your rear point in order to bring your axle back the appropriate 7 degrees. Again, using an angle finder on a flat surface, make sure that it's 7 degrees on both sides. Now your last 3 dimensions you're going to take to make sure that your chassis is square are these. You're going to measure your wheelbase, or from any flat point on the front axle to the rear axle on both sides. Those 2 dimensions should check out. Now the last 2 is going to be from corner to corner. If both of those dimensions are the same, then congratulations. Your chassis is all squared with your suspension and everything is level. You are now ready to start welding up all your suspension mounts. Now from here on out, the instructions are going to vary depending on what type of suspension you're running. So I hope the instructions that came with your kit, or whatever you ended up Googling if you bought things from the swap meet, are enough to get you to the finish line. Now, I just spent the past 8 hours recording this and still have to edit, so it would mean the world to me if you take the quick second to subscribe. If you have any questions, you can always reach out to me on my personal page, that is Enya_garage, or my actual business page, which is CaliRod_shop. Now for part 3, we're going to actually talk about steering. I hope to be able to talk about the beginner's guides of the different types of steering and get into the details of cross steering. But before we get there, I got to finish buttoning the rear end, the front end up, and make this thing into an actual roller. Thanks again so much for watching. Please comment, like, subscribe, and we'll see you in the next one.